Perfect. So our talk tonight is UX in praxis, winning a seat at the table. So we're super excited to have Chuck McKinnon, who's the president of Lightburn Software, joining us today. So it's one of the world's most popular software for laser cutters. And going back, he founded the UX team at Smart Technologies back in 2002 and spent the next 15 years leading teams doing UX as well as data visualization. So having been a software developer, a UX team lead, a consultant, and now an executive, super well positioned in order to help people from lots of different kinds of roles understand and influence each other. In his spare time, wrenches on cars, enjoys hiking and canoeing, and has somehow developed a Docker container self-hosting hobby. So he comes to us from Cochrane, Alberta, with his wife and 2 younger children. And yeah, from there he lifts, although his 16-year-old son just beat his deadlift record. So
yes, he did.
I'll mention that as well.
Yeah.
Awesome. So without further ado, I will stop sharing and hand it over to Chuck and join me in welcoming him here today.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to keep this very light on slides tonight. I have exactly 1 slide for you. And this represents basically everything I know about this topic in a bite-sized piece. So the idea here is I'm just going to riff on these things for about 20 minutes. I have a bunch of prepared notes. If you see me glancing off to the side, it's because I'm checking my second screen to make sure that I have all of that. And then I just want to ask you to put any questions you've got in the chat. Dave's going to go through and sort of collate them and make sure that there's remove duplicates perhaps, and just make sure that we've got them all in there. And then we can open it up for discussion at the end of this. So I'm just going to jump right in. So the proposed title was, UX and a seat at the table, but it might be applied to any situation where you're looking for a way to move the needle even when you don't have positional authority. In the role that I'm in now as president of Lightburn, I've got some of that positional authority, and yet even there, it's the kind of thing that I think is best used sparingly, if at all. Sometimes you do have to be the person to call a particular shot or make a decision about what will or won't be done or how it'll be done. But it's not the kind of thing that is undertaken lightly. And this kind of influence that we're going to be talking about here, I think, tends to, because it involves other people and an understanding of their needs, I think it is more effective in most of the cases that we deal with. So if you looked at the summary for tonight, we talked about, if any of you've been in, I'm assuming most of you are here because you've been in some of these situations, like where you're asked to anoint an existing design rather than to help to shape it, or your design concerns are brushed aside in favor of other priorities like ship date or budget. Or if you've been hired into a UX role, or you've been able to hire and grow your team a bit, but maybe you struggle to influence how decisions are made in your organization and how the products are developed. And that being the case, we're going to talk about sort of 2 scenarios here. One is when you're building either from scratch or you're building back. So maybe you're establishing a new practice, you're the sole practitioner, or you've been the sole practitioner and now you're able to hire a team. Or maybe you're building back from a situation where the team didn't have a lot of credibility previously, or did, and it didn't go that well, or new people have been brought in. How do you get, even if you don't have that positional authority, in which case you may be able to make things happen more quickly, how do you manage to get how do you manage to get things done anyway, which is why I put that title in the slide. So I want to walk the whole process here from front to back. I want to simplify as much as I can without simplifying to the point that it is useless to you. And I'll invite you to do 2 things. One is just take what's useful and make sense in your context and abandon the rest. And the second is to ask clarifying questions once this part of the presentation is over. So I'm going to brain dump here for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll reserve the rest of the time for questions and discussion. So we're going to start with mindset, understanding your audience and knowing your decision makers as well as your customers, what matters in their world and what keeps them up at night. For me, in order to understand your internal stakeholder audience well, and in order to do the job of a UX practitioner well, there are 3 foundational beliefs that you probably already have, and one that you may or may not. So the ones that I think most people come into this field with are, number one, that your customers find value in whatever your company already produces, whether that's products or services. Number two is that those products and services are improvable. They're susceptible. They can be made better than they are today. And number three is that you or your team have the skills to make those things better than they were. And you're able to help your company get from here to there. So those things, I think, are relatively uncontroversial. If you don't believe that your customers find value in existing products or services and don't know that those are susceptible to improvement, it may be challenging to have the confidence in the process to move any further forward. The fourth one, though, is that I suspect that most people in the organization actually want the same outcomes that you want. It may not be apparent, but in my experience, most people will gladly follow you on the path of improvement, or at least they will back it if you can show success. And we're going to talk about how it is that that stuff happens and how it can be made to happen, I think, a bit more smoothly. So one of my favorite thinkers in this space is Elliot Aronson, who is, I think, the only living psychologist to win all three of the APA's major awards, one for research, one for teaching, and one for writing. And he coined a favorite phrase. Aronson said, "People do crazy things for non-crazy reasons." And so in scenarios where there is, where you can't seem to gain traction for ideas that you know would improve existing products, or you can't reach the decision makers in a way that's timely enough to get things done, one of the most useful things that I've found is a way to close an empathy gap or an understanding gap between the UX team and the development team. And in my case, most of my background being software, and the executive or business team that has to make decisions on products. We will regularly encounter people, policies, and procedures that feel as though they were custom designed, in my experience, by a particularly cunning sadist, somebody who knows us far too well and knows exactly what to do to tick us off. When something really gets under our skin, we are tempted to respond in kind. We withhold cooperation, trust, whatever we feel was denied to us. And however real those feelings are, and they are real, my experience is that they're often not accurate. And that's Aronson's point, that people do crazy things for non-crazy reasons. I have had a lot of luck with one of the things that when I used to work for VanUE, who is a company that sold, competitive with like Getty Images and iStock, they were eventually acquired by Corbis. VanUE had a situation where they were trying to significantly grow revenue at a time they'd been acquired. They'd been growing really, really quickly, and they'd made certain commitments about when they were going to, how much more they were going to grow in the coming years. And they were really at a loss for how they were going to manage to do that, given the budget that they faced. The company, the parent company, had never turned a profit. For those of you who don't know, Corbis Images used to be wholly owned by Bill Gates, and they were the major competitor for Getty Images, and they had never turned a profit. And so every year they had to go back to Daddy Warbucks for another so many tens of millions of dollars in order to make ends meet. And they weren't, the new CEO was bound and determined that they were going to break even that year. If they couldn't turn a profit, they were at least going to break even. But in order for VanUE to deliver the growth that they had promised upon being acquired, they were counting on reinvesting all of their money in new growth. And so there were incentives that the executives at Corbis were responding to. There were incentives that the executives at VanUE were responding to that were not at odds with, but that were not available to or transparent to the website team who were creating the products that ultimately, the way of showcasing the products that ultimately we wanted people to buy. And it was only because I stumbled on a conversation between a couple of the execs about what their goals and incentives were that I was able to bring that information into the conversation. And it sparked an awareness in me that we had been operating half blind with a laser focus on the customer and how the customer was behaving on Veer's website, which was the only sales channel, but without an understanding of the business realities that were driving these seemingly the decisions that some of the execs were taking that just baffled us from the perspective that we were looking at it from in the website team. And so subsequent to that, when I changed roles, I started working with somebody who came in very hard-headed, very pragmatic, pretty demanding, and just very imperatively, we've got it, this has to get done, that has to get done, these things have to get done, and sort of brooked no opposition. And remembering what had happened at Veer, I booked a 1-hour meeting with her, and I set up an open-ended conversation. And I said, tell me about your world. Tell me about what matters to you. And a phrase that, what keeps you up at night. When doing usability tests or customer research, there's a phrase that I've used a lot that seems to work pretty well, which is, if you could wave a magic wand and make everything just work, assuming the technology wasn't a problem, all the behind the scenes stuff was just magic and you could wave the magic wand, what would you do? What would this look like when it's done? And that's been very effective, I've found, in drawing users and customers out, or design teams out, about what they want or what the product should do or what the service should do. And this was a similar question for one of the business decision makers. What keeps you up at night? What do you agonize over? What are you worried about? And it was like I opened the floodgates. She bent my ear for a solid hour, and we had to book another hour subsequently so that I could capture all of this information. And that conversation with her did two things. One, it built rapport and built trust between the two of us. And that let her know that we were on her side, that my team wanted her to succeed. And we now understood what she cared about. And the second thing it did was that it gave us a much better understanding of those imperatives so that we could do the things that we needed to do in an effective way. And we could frame our findings in a context that she would understand. I know that, okay. And I know that set the relationship off on a better footing. So step one that I have here is understand your audience, know your decision makers, as well as your customers, what matters in their world, what keeps them up at night. I have used that framing to tremendous effect ever since I stumbled into it back in 2008 when I happened to go to Veer, and realized that, subsequent to Veer, that we'd been making decisions that we thought were right for customers, but we had no idea. We were totally clueless about what the business actually needed and what they cared about. And the irony, of course, is that these are skills that we are supposed to be good at as UX practitioners, drawing people out, understanding the context of use, understanding the needs of our audience. And I guess the primary thrust of this point is that there is more than one audience. And if that audience has authority, decision-making authority, but doesn't know you or your team, doesn't understand us and how we work and how we make decisions, then they're much more likely to brush our concerns aside than if we understand them well enough to become the bridge between the business requirements and the customer requirements, because we understand both well enough to translate and look for ways that things can be done. And you see this, there are all kinds of examples of this outside of our particular field. In his book, Knowledge and Decisions, the American economist Thomas Sowell writes repeatedly about the impossibility of making good decisions when there's no feedback loop that brings the consequence of the decision back. So he said, and I'm going to quote you from the preface just briefly, one of the central themes of this book is that feedback mechanisms are crucial in a world where no given individual or manageably sized group is likely to have sufficient knowledge to be consistently right the first time in their decisions. These feedback mechanisms must convey not only information, but also incentives to act on that information, whether these incentives are provided by prices, by love, by fear, by moral codes, or by other factors which cause people to act in the interest of other people. So our blindness to the consequences of our decisions isn't just limited to, government or corporate or organizational policy making. It crops up in relationship contexts, for example, right? It is really, really liberating to recognize this as a common human failure mode, and to assume then that when someone is making decisions in our organization that seem utterly baffling to us, especially when we've done our due diligence to collect user information or to do user interface testing, and we know we have information that's potentially valuable to the company, and yet other people are making decisions that disregard it. In my experience, this is almost always because they are responding to imperatives that are outside our visibility. If we're able to connect what we know with what they know and care about, they will listen. If we can't, then we are much more likely to be left out of the loop, and it will be very difficult to acquire that authority regardless of what the nominal position we hold is, because we simply aren't able to express it in a way that makes sense to both sets of audiences. I know I said I was going to go on for a bit, run the rest of these and then ask questions, but this feels like a good point because I saw a comment about, appreciating the individual experiences. This feels like a good point to ask everybody in attendance if there are any questions about this particular thing, or if anybody wants to chime in with any comparable experience.
Who was it that you were quoting about the feedback loop?
Oh, that was Thomas Sowell's book, Knowledge and Decisions.
Okay.
I've got to warn you, that's one of the densest intellectual books I've ever encountered. Sowell is a hellaciously brilliant thinker, and it is a very dense book, but it rewards careful study. It is not a casual read.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Anybody else? Okay. So if we want to have those kinds of conversations with people, how do we do this in a way that actually makes it effective and isn't likely to scare them off or create a rift or anything like that? So there are a few steps to this. Step one for me is I have to remind myself that it isn't personal, these differences. And I really mean them. If I don't remind myself, if I will screw up step two, which is I have to demonstrate empathy. I have to learn the reasons for the existing policy or practice and the incentives that reinforce it. Then I have to invite empathy in return and share the pain by sharing the consequences, or if that's not possible, by sharing stories about the consequences. So one project that I worked in for an oil and gas major, there was a team of developers who were responsible to me for delivery, and they were regularly completing work. And this was putting us behind schedule, but I only managed the project, not the people. This was a so-called matrix organization, right? Where the people doing the work reported to someone else for their people management and only reported to me for the project. So when I was frustrated, I would describe this as I only had carrots at my disposal and no sticks. And I really felt like I wanted both. It was embarrassing to me to report to our out-of-town client that we were late again on features that were not complicated to develop. And I was indignant about having to bear those consequences alone. Polite requests for improvement sort of seemed to go unheeded. They were listened to, agreed to, and then ignored. The previous project manager had an adversarial relationship with the developer's manager, which didn't help things. It made me reluctant to force the issue, frankly. But things couldn't continue as they were going, or I was at risk of losing a valued client. So I was in the terrible position of having to follow my own advice. I booked a meeting with the other manager. And to start the discussion on the right foot, I had to demonstrate empathy. And to do that, I had to set aside my outrage, which I was very much feeling, and try to understand why things were going the way they were. And I had to assume that the failures weren't deliberate. So for those of you who are familiar with the term, the fundamental attribution error, this won't be a surprise, right? We tend to attribute other people's bad behavior to their character. We attribute our own bad behavior to circumstance. Isn't that convenient? Now, if you hurt my feelings, you probably did it on purpose. But if I hurt your feelings, of course I didn't do it on purpose. And so you shouldn't be so sensitive, right? This is how these things tend to go. So I began the meeting by telling the manager that I knew her developers were responsible for other projects, and I invited her to tell me what things were like in her world, because I was hoping that if I understood that better, that I could appropriately set expectations with the client, and then I could have better informed discussions with the developers when they gave me estimates. But I knew nothing about their work, and I admitted it. Now, that all probably sounds very, very reasonable. But the fact is, I was so indignant about the impossibility of the situation that I'd been put in that I had to rehearse my opening lines. I could not go into that, to avoid starting the meeting very much on the wrong foot, right? I could not go into that meeting unless I had rehearsed my opening lines. And think of it as a way of encoding my first step. Remind yourself it isn't personal. What I really wanted to say is, why is this team so incompetent, and why are you defending them? And that wasn't going to get the result that I was aiming for. So with a softer startup to our meeting, though, the other manager responded. She opened up. Yes, they had other projects. They had about a dozen other projects, as a matter of fact. And this was a team of 6 or 7 people. Some of those projects were already in production. So if one of those broke, it took over practically everything else. And it meant that it wreaked havoc with everyone else's schedule, because they could not return to developing new stuff until the production stuff had been fixed. Sometimes they didn't know how long that was going to take. Everybody, not just me, but all dozen project managers wanted their projects to come first, and they couldn't understand the delays, and so on. So now we were getting somewhere. Then I had to explain to this manager that I attended the client meetings by myself, and if the deadlines were missed, the team only felt the consequences secondhand. I was the one who had to wear the egg on my face when we were late. I said I could help set realistic expectations with the client, but once they were set, then missing them damaged our collective reputation. And she could understand that. So she started volunteering to come to the meetings with me, so that she felt the pain firsthand and could transmit that in return to the team, and help me manage the people on the team who were maybe being a bit too ambitious in the expectations they were setting, and so on. So 2 things were crucial to the success of that discussion. The first was, I recognized that I was guilty of the same kind of ignorance that the developers were. They didn't understand the pain that I was in because of what they weren't doing, and I didn't understand the pain that they were in, which was causing them to behave the way they were. All of those things made sense once we had those conversations. But until we had, it was very, very difficult. This happened in multiple cycles, and you can imagine the frustration builds, right, on both sides. I'm getting more impatient. They're feeling more pressure. Nobody's going to solve the problem this way. And I was literally oblivious to how much other work was on their plate, just as they were oblivious to mine. Dave, you asked how does one reframe that conversation in a softer way? It was literally me going in and saying, I know that there's been some, there've been some balls dropped, right? We've missed some existing deadlines. I'm assuming that there's, it's rarely just like, it's not like people do these things out of malice typically, right? So something's up. I have no idea what's up. Tell me what's happening in your world. What's going on? And I just, with no judgment, just sat back and invited her to let me know and explain what was happening. And she did. And that got us to a point where we'd be able to move on. And one of the other things that helped to reframe that more softly is we refrain from speculating about each other's motives, right? I bet you guys have all seen those email translation things that go around every now and again. Per my last email, translated means, why didn't you read this the first time? Those kinds of things. We refrain from speculating about each other's motives. So this approach isn't always going to work, because occasionally, rarely in my experience, you do encounter people who are just bloody-minded and have no interest in cooperating with other people. But it's also been my experience that that's vanishingly rare. Across the span of my career, I can think of exactly 2 people that fit that characterization, who just seem to resist all attempts to be accommodating or understanding, and so on. So let's assume that part is out of the way. Now you've got some understanding of the business side, and you already have done, I'm assuming for the purposes of this discussion, user testing or customer research, or something that lets you chart a path to how can our products or services be better. And you want to build credibility the best thing I can suggest is start with the quick wins. So what we're looking for here in quick wins, low-hanging fruit, whatever you want to call it, are high impact and relatively low effort things that are at the intersection of that customer need and the business imperative. And this is a partial quote from George Patton, the World War II general for the Americans, a good plan today. What he said was, a good plan violently executed today is better than a perfect plan tomorrow. This is because what's helped in this context for me is to think in terms of Pareto optimality. So Villaford Pareto is the origin of the 80-20 idea. 80% of effects come from about 20% of the causes. If you can look at something in your product or your service offering that if you could just tweak one thing would remove all kinds of frustration for people or give them dramatically improved capabilities over what they had before, then that's an excellent thing to shoot for out of the gate. And if it's relatively easy to implement, so much the better. Way back at the beginning of my UX career, when I worked for Smart, we discovered something really, really interesting about the limits of human vision and something the size of a smart board and projector resolution, and we were able to get a quick win out of that. So if any of you has read Colin Ware on the human visual system, I think Ware's got a big, like an Elsevier textbook, but he's also got a much narrower one. It turns out that the fovea in the dead center of the human eye is about the size of your thumbnail held at arm's length. And in the center of the fovea, you can resolve about 100 points on the head of a pin. It's incredibly accurate visual acuity. But as you move off center, you go 10, 20, 30 degrees off center, by the time you're 30 degrees off center, all you can detect is movement. And you don't think that's all you can see, because your brain, when you look around a room, when you enter a new space, your brain performs a series of rapid eye movements called saccades, and it builds a picture of the room in much the same way that if you've ever yanked a Google map really fast, you can watch the tiles pop in. Your brain will rapidly capture things in the space and then say, okay, hold that picture and tell me if anything moves. So we had this utterly fascinating thing that would happen on a smart board where somebody would open like Windows Explorer and they'd go looking for a file and they'd be standing at the board doing this, right? And somebody at the back of the room would be going, it's right, it's just over your left shoulder, it's right there. And what we realized was when people were close to the board, they're 10 degrees off of visual acuity was a cone about this big, like it really was not very big at all. So that Windows Explorer thing that was only 8 or 10 inches away from where they were looking was literally invisible to them. And we started noticing this problem with a lot of other object interactions on the board. Windows at the time, Windows XP was just never built to be used on a 6-foot smartboard. Try to get a teacher, a 5'4" teacher, to hit the save button at the top of a Windows toolbar on a 6-foot board, right? Just two things that we did. One was making it possible to move the toolbar to the bottom, because 8-year-old kids can't hit the save button at the top of the board either. So just that one thing, can we move the toolbar, got a big reaction out of our customer base, and it was trivial for the developers to implement. One of the other things was creating because there's no way to right click on a board. Well, there is now, but at the time there was no way to trigger a right click action on the board. But we pushed the right click context menu into a little drop down arrow at the side of the bounding box. So if you've ever used Illustrator or Inkscape or anything like that, you click an object and you get a bounding box, right? That'll usually have rotate handles or drag handles. And in the top right corner, we put a little drop down arrow that would allow you to open the right click context menu. And that meant you could move with your eye across the bounding box of the object, find the top right corner, and trigger the right click menu. And there, in a relatively compact visual layout, were all of the commands that you could do on that object without having to scan all over the board for where the buttons were. The buttons work great on a developer's desktop. They didn't work so well on a 6-foot board when people were standing that close. So we started with the quick one, which was the Toolbar Move. And the teachers loved it. And we got emails in customer support that the teachers loved it. And we fed those emails back to the developers, back to Solo's point about feedback loops. And we took those to the business people and said, look, just this one little thing, and it's made a world of difference. And from there, we were able to go to the much more complex step, which was adding that right-click context menu and pushing all of the functionality onto the object so that we could get that done. It was actually a couple of steps. It was first the toolbar, then we shrunk the toolbar from 2 rows to 1, so that we could free up a lot more space, since projectors back then were running 800 by 600. And then we went for the full right-click context capability. So we started with the quick wins. We sold the improvements. We built the case and sold the improvements to the internal audience. If there's no participation, there will be no buy-in. So when we try to do these things in ways that don't resonate with our target audience, or we try to do them around people, we will often encounter resistance. But my experience has been that if we build that understanding with the audience back in step 1, then when we aim for the quick wins, we have both the understanding and the language to be able to explain it in a way that makes for a pretty compelling story. And if we take that compelling story, enact the improvements, and then evangelize the results, this is a bit Machiavellian. The quote that I put there, success is 1,000 fathers, but failure is an orphan. So everybody wants to get behind a success story, but nobody wants to be associated with a failure. And so if you pick a solid quick win, you can enact that improvement relatively quickly, and you can show improvement in some measurable metric that your audience cares about, your internal stakeholder audience cares about, then you are much more likely at that point to have people go, oh, that's what all this is about, and to be able to go forward from there with much more ambitious work, because now people have seen the whole cycle sort of in fast forward from beginning to end, and they go, hey, that was worth doing. That worked. That moved the needle. And what I have typically found is that some people will be blasé about it, but there will be other people in different parts of the organization who genuinely care about the customer success and the company's success, who will join with you in that situation and go, yeah, this is great. We need more of this. That is a very sort of high level overview of all this with a couple of illustrative stories. If anybody's got any questions, if they want to unmute or just like talk in person, then you're welcome to. I'm happy to go deeper on any of these things and to explain or answer questions or entertain anybody else's similar stories.
Feel free to type in the chat or put your hand up, and then we can unmute yourself if you got questions for Chuck.
Okay. Well, if not at the moment, I will give you one other illustration of going from step 2 to step 4 here. I mentioned Veer earlier, and the situation where I overheard something about the pressure the execs were under to deliver growth. So we had a very, for the day, for 2008, a very rather unusually sophisticated analytics system that was wired into Veer, so we could track the entire customer journey through the site. Oh, thanks. I saw a comment. I'm enjoying stories. And one of the analysts and I started to put a story together. We knew the conversion rate was only sitting at about 2%. I can tell all these stories now because Veer's now defunct. Corbis bought them, ran them as a separate brand for some years, then absorbed them into the mothership and did away with the brand entirely, and then sold off the constituent parts to a Chinese company who licensed everything outside of China to Getty Images. So Getty finally got to buy Corbis. That's a bit inside baseball for anybody who hasn't worked in that space, but if anybody here has history with iStock or Getty or Corbis, that will be, Getty wanted to buy them for a long, long time. Anyway, we were looking at why that was. And so I went and did a bit of user research out and went to the various agencies in Calgary, Evans Hunt, Critical Mass, and watched people use Veer in context. So a contextual inquiry, a site visit. And what I saw was fascinating. We'd have people open half a dozen tabs and they'd go Getty, Veer, Comstock, Jupiter, iStock, Corbis, back to the first tab, search, 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 back to the first. And by the time they'd done their search query in multiple tabs and they flip back to the beginning, the search results had started to load. And what I saw was people would almost always search with 1 or 2 word queries. They'd start with vineyard, right? And they'd start getting vineyard results and they'd be like, oh yeah. But I'm trying to make marketing material for a new retirement community in the Okanagan. So what I really care about is a couple over a certain age in a vineyard, not looking at the camera, blah, 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 right? And they began to become a great deal more specific once the first results had come in. One of the most enlightening results was I saw somebody search for oil derrick, and when all the results came in, she said, like, she watched the results pop in on the screen and was like, oh yeah, but not the Middle East, right? Well, oil derrick, but not the Middle East is like a huge chunk of your results, right? If those are the pictures you're looking for. And I started to realize that I was seeing a pattern that Ben Schneiderman's team out at the University of Maryland first described back in the 90s, which was, how do people look for something in a nebulous search space? So you're looking for something and you don't know what you're looking for, but you'll know it when you see it. So, you know, I want to buy a house and there might be 10,000 houses on the market and I need to find 3 that I can get serious about. I, you know, want to rent a movie. I can spend, I think The Onion or the Babylon Bee, somebody did a thing about Netflix introduces $2.99 a month browse titles program, where you just spend all your time going through and looking at the movies, but never actually watching one, right? But I know it when I find it, you know, okay, maybe I'm in the mood for comedy or action. And what Schneiderman's team came up with was, and I will get to the question about feedback loops because this is relevant here, so thank you for that. But what Schneiderman's team discovered was that when you're looking for something in a nebulous search space, you know, I want to date somebody, right? But I don't want to be set up on 50 blind dates. How do I find, people follow a pattern, and that pattern, which anybody who works in search or anything like this, tattoo the inside of their eyelids, which is overview first, then zoom and filter, then details on demand, right? And that pattern is exactly that, right? First, I want an overview of everything that's available. Then I want to rapidly hack away at the stuff I'm not interested in. And then with what's left, I want to be able to get details immediately on everything that is of interest. So in the case of the people who are starting their search with vineyard, but actually wanted to know, you know, actually wanted to see older people of appropriate retirement age in a vineyard, not looking at the camera, you know, with good light and all this other stuff. That's what they were really looking for, but they didn't know it until they'd started their search by going, oh, I'll look for vineyard, right? So what I saw them do on some of the other sites was use a set of filters that enabled them to really, really quickly hack away at the stuff they were no longer interested in. And the irony was that Veer had all of the tagging necessary to do those kinds of faceted searches, but we hadn't enabled any of those filters. And so we were losing. So the critical thing here for the feedback loop was Veer had committed to a certain growth rate, but the only way they knew how to increase growth was to increase the number of people who came to the site, which meant more marketing materials. So with this one analyst, Julian and I, we dug into the data and discovered that we had 10 times as many people visiting the site and completing a legitimate search. And by legitimate, I mean we filtered out things like, you know, porn keywords and people who search by SKU, so they knew exactly which image they wanted and those kinds of things, right? Tire kickers. And we had more than 10 times as many people completing a legitimate search, but not taking the next step as we had people who completed a purchase. 10 times. So the pitch I made to exec was, yes, we can grow revenue by spending more money on bringing more people to the site, or we could do a better job of serving the people who are already coming. And so what we did was put together a 5-point plan. We went through, to shorten the story, we went through the whole site and looked at search, image detail, registration, checkout, the whole process, the entire funnel, and came up with a 5-point plan to improve the conversion rate by half, meaning we'd be able to go from 2% to 3%, we figured was a safe bet, just based on the sheer volume of people who, you know, I search for mountains and I get 20,000 results and I have to go through them 50 images at a time, page after page after page, with no way to winnow that down. I'm going to abandon your site, you know, and tying that user experience that we had seen to the business drivers that the executives were feeling the pressure from, enabled us to get the green light to do that project. And the first thing we did was fix the filters on the images and make those available. And the weekend we launched, sales jumped by 12% and stayed there. And so that was where I first got a glimpse of the power of, VEER was one of the best run organizations I've ever been privileged to be a part of. So it was just a lot of fun to be able to dig in, get the data, make the case, and do it. I happened to be in an organization where that kind of thinking and involvement was welcome. We're not always so fortunate, are we, in the positions we're in our careers? But that was what got me hooked on this essential path, because when it was done, we did a great big presentation at one of the theaters just outside of downtown Calgary and explained to everybody what we had done and what was coming, and told this story to link all the pieces together so that we could get the teams excited about what was going on. So could I talk a bit more on managing the feedback loops? What methods worked better for developers? For developers, one of the things that worked best was, there were two things. One was dragging them up to the site visits where that was possible, getting them to, or at least getting them to watch users use the software that they were creating. There is a bit of a Dilbert stereotype, I guess you could call it, about developers being very sort of geeky and focused and not really being too interested in the people side of things. But most people prefer their work to be meaningful. And my experience has been that if the developers know that what they're working on is actually going to make a material difference in the experience of the people using their stuff, they will buy in right away. So when we did a site visit in an elementary school for SMART, I was able to get 2 developers at a time to come with me. One of them was one of the firmware guys, and he watched some 8-year-old kid grab a circle and try to drag it across the board. And he couldn't push hard enough to make contact with the back surface of the board that was required in order to make the object move consistently. And this kid was embarrassed because there he is in front of all of his friends and he's dropping the ball literally as he's moving across the screen. And this guy went back to the office and hammered away on how long can we wait after detecting a loss of contact before we stop the object. Because of course, if you keep it moving in the same direction indefinitely, it will just ghost across the screen when nobody's touching it. You don't want that. But how many milliseconds can we get away with to give this kid time to put his hand back on it without it stopping and falling behind him? And he managed to find an in-between position that significantly improved the outcomes. Now, in that case, I was able to take people for a site visit, but often it was just recording the video of the user testing and letting the developers watch people bang their heads unsuccessfully into the problem. And the earlier you can get that data with prototypes, the better, because then developers' egos aren't invested in it yet, right? Alan Cooper, if anybody's read his stuff from back in the day, I mean, he wrote a couple of books. The Inmates Are Running in the Asylum was one, and some of the other stuff. He has a great line, which is code is like concrete. And, you know, just like it's easier to correct an architectural or an engineering error on a building when it's only in the drawing and planning stage, it's much, much easier to change an interface at the prototype stage. But if an organization is not used to working that way, then they have to see some success. And my experience with developers is if they see people struggle to use their product, they will sometimes initially be resistant because they go, oh no, that, you know, it's just a dumb user, just somebody who doesn't understand how to do it. But if you watch like 3 people in a row all struggle at the same point, and you know you can fix it, then I find that many people are of pretty good will and are motivated to fix whatever the problem was. We got a new one.
Yeah, the other 2 parts
right. Yeah,
of my question. So like you communicating to leadership maybe earlier in your career, and then the flip side, yourself now, how do you prefer to be communicated with these kinds of feedback loops and pitches and that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I am always impressed if somebody comes to me with the best information they have, right? So if someone can come to me and demonstrate that they're not just status seeking, they're not just running with a hunch, they're not just running with opinion, they can say, we know there's this issue, we know people have been asking for this, we know there's this business driver for it, cost, complexity, level of support, whatever. And they can tell a persuasive story about if we fix this thing, We may not know the magnitude of the effect, but we can expect that these things will get better. And here's why those things matter. I am way more likely to say, all right, just go do it. I will acknowledge that one of the things I love about running Lightburn is being able to build the kind of company that the founder, Jason Doria, and I both want to work at. I'm delighted to be able to push decision-making as far down the tree as I can. And there's a couple of things that Jay and I are the bottleneck on right now because of some organizational structure stuff that we are actively working to remove. So anytime anybody can give that kind of context, it shows that they understand the broader problem or a set of problems, and they are enthusiastically looking to solve those problems. And when you know that somebody cares about the work and they've done their homework, it's really pretty easy to go, yep, you know what you're doing, off you go. Anything that demonstrates credibility will build trust, I think is what it boils down to. Okay, questions, comments? Just looking through the list of people here. Okay, well, this is about it, folks. This is in a sense all I know. But I think the critical thing here, because a lot of this stuff about start with quick wins, sell the improvements, and evangelize, I think a lot of people in our community are already pretty good at that, especially finding the wins that that the users care about, knowing if you could just get these one or two things done, that it would really make a material difference in people's experience with the product or service. And ideally, you're working in an area where you know that customers already value whatever it is that your company does or your organization does. But the ability to build credibility by tying those customer needs to something that decision makers in the business already care about. The fact that I stumbled into that insight in Veer, literally by overhearing a hallway conversation, was just crucial to my understanding of hacking this process from the beginning. I had been missing a critical first step, which I kind of feel embarrassed about discussing because, again, it's in the nature of our toolkit that I think I should have known better, but I didn't. I was focused on my own narrow little world and couldn't see past it. Allison, did you have you turned your camera on? Okay.
Sorry, I think I'm used to being in an organization where you keep your camera on during the meeting, so I'm not used to having everybody off.
Yeah, no sweat. Let's see, what have we got here? Okay. Going through this process would make a nice mini case study. Yes, I agree. These things have lent themselves very well to case studies and workshops in the past. Target audience is a wide range of users from 12 to 50. Do you focus on multiple personas, or is there some other method and tool that can help with categorization, building trust and getting buy-in, change development culture, being more user-centered? Okay, so these are all really, really good. I will just take them from the top and see what I'm going to hit stop share on this just for a second so I can check my clock. Okay. So let's just start with this one. In establishing personas in regard to a target audience with a wide range of users. So without understanding more about that specific context, I can say that one of the useful lenses through which I've looked at these things in the past has been Clayton Christensen and what's the other guy's name? Anyway, if you look up Clayton Christensen, you'll find it. He's the guy who's from behind the idea of disruptive innovation, who wrote the book, The Innovator's Dilemma back in the 90s. He's also behind an idea that's called jobs to be done. And it's the idea that, people often buy products or services in order to accomplish a task, in order to get a job done. And trying to find out what those tasks or jobs are and breaking them down so that breaking the personas down by the job that the thing is being hired to do is often where I'll make a first cut. If you know that there's some people use it for this and some people use it for that, then the age range doesn't tend to matter as much, or other variables. This is always the problem, right? I know Magdalena, who was on my team at CGI, gave a presentation a few months ago where she talked about the persona work that we did for the city of Lethbridge. And with Lethbridge, that was what we did there was we knew that more than 4 or 5 personas would be ignored. So we took as much information as we could find, and we we filtered some of we knew that some of the jobs people had or some of the problems they had with the existing website overlapped the various demographic groups. So you have people who may not be especially well educated, whose language skills aren't, you have to write for a certain grade level. And that also helps the people who are recent immigrants where English is not their first language, for example. We couldn't represent all of those concerns in all of the various groups that we found. So we paired them, we looked for the 80-20, right? We looked for the big things that we knew were the largest impacts on the site, things like findability, things like having 6 or 7 different logins to access different services when people really wanted to be able to just log in once because they saw the city as a monolithic entity. I'm just transacting with the city, not with the different departments. And we focused on those first as the first cuts to be done. So I guess if you're working on personas, the more you know about the relative importance of the tasks to be done, you can start with the first 4 or 5 of those, and then try to group your personas by whatever is most relevant to getting those things accomplished. Without knowing more about the specifics, I think that's the best information I can offer. I hope that's helpful. Building trust and getting buy-in with individuals is important. Any tips or stories about changing development culture, existing processes to be more user-centered? Every time that I've done this, where I've been able to change the processes, it's been because of either direct developer experience with watching people use the product, or because I've been able to tell a compelling story to people about people using the product. So I mean, I was talking about this kid standing up in front of the classroom and being a little embarrassed because he kept dropping the object on the smartboard, and Phil commented, "Oh," with a sad face, right? It's not hard to evoke empathy when you're talking about elementary age school kids. It's not hard for people to put themselves in their shoes if you can tell a compelling story about how something is failing an audience and causing them pain. The best way I found is to actually bring people along and let them observe for themselves, because then there's no he said, she said involved. It kind of takes the ego out of it. But failing that, the ability to represent the story of someone else, especially if you can just lay the bare facts out without getting too emotionally involved in it so people don't get defensive. Storytelling has been one of the best catalysts for that. And it will often make people, in my experience, more curious. They're like, well, wait a minute, when that happened, how did it happen? What was going on at the time? How, they want to know more if it invites them in. Direct observation or story. Jared Spool from UIE, User Interface Engineering, years ago, he said, in their experience, the organizations where someone with decision-making authority, I'd almost forgotten about this, watches a customer interact directly with the company's product at least once every 6 weeks seems to be the limit. If you can get somebody with decision-making authority to watch users or like read customer tickets or anything that closes that feedback loop, at least once every 6 weeks, you stand a much better chance of moving the needle, because they're not able to insulate themselves from customer pain. And I agree with that. This is back to feedback again, right? The more this stuff becomes prevalent, one of the things that we did at Smart was to collect the ticket data from the customer support people, and we would feed it back to, like, I'd basically tally them as votes. We'd get a whole bunch of emails about 3 or 4 key things, and then we could take that to the development team and say, we got 65 emails about this, we got 30 emails about the other thing, we got 18 emails about the third, and we got half a dozen about the fourth. And can we start with this? And then you can read, because people would often describe their problems. Well, the developers weren't reading the support tickets. They were getting those interpreted for them. And so that insulated them a bit from the feedback loop. So tightening that loop was ultimately key. For people who are far removed from leadership, but there isn't any easy access to executive, in that case, the best success that I've seen has been implementing those quick wins and having a good story to tell. It is easy to bubble up a positive outcome all as far up the food chain as you want, because everybody wants to back the winning team, right? If you've managed to do even a small thing like it's smart when you move the toolbar down that customers are just so appreciative of, and you can get that appreciation moved up the chain, it doesn't just make you look good. That's point 4 on my thing said, evangelize and share credit. That's when you say, we found this stuff and the development team implemented this thing, and here was the outcome. Look at all the praise we're getting from our customers. Look at the drop in support tickets related to this problem that we had that we no longer have anymore. We estimate that this is saving us X number of support hours that we were devoting to this every month in the past. Anything you can do to tell a positive story about a successful outcome is much easier to bubble up the chain. And that's why I encourage starting with small wins, because if you get a small win and you can show that you are happy to involve all of the people, customer support, the sales staff in the companies that I've worked at often have really good customer insights, right? When you become the nexus for pulling all of those disparate parts together, and you're the one, or your team are the ones who craft the stories about how all those pieces tie together, then the faster you can churn out those success stories, the more credibility it builds, and the more people will say, oh, I wonder about this. I wonder if that team has any insight, because they usually know about this stuff, or they track this stuff, and they pull the stories together. Putting the effort into collating that stuff has been typically really successful.
Awesome. Well, we're coming up right up on the hour. One last call for any last questions. Feel free to type that in. But yeah, I wanted to thank you, Chuck, for spending some time with us and sharing your advice and your insight. Definitely, I appreciated it.
My pleasure. I still really enjoy this stuff. I still geek out on this. So it's a delight to be able to come and share some of this stuff with other people. I just hope that some of it is useful. As I said at the beginning, take what, people are in all different kinds of organizations. Take what's useful. I hope some of this has proven food for thought. If anybody wants references to any of the books or materials that I mentioned, feel free to follow up with Dave or with me directly, or he can pass those on, and I'm happy to provide any additional information if people want it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Actually, on that point, how can people contact you?
The quickest way is just chuck@chuckmckinnon.com.
Okay.
Email is the easiest way.
Awesome. So I'll make sure to include that when we send out that resource list.
You betcha.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining. We'll be announcing kind of our June event shortly, so keep in tune for that. And yeah, just wanted to give another big thank you to Chuck for spending the hour with us. It's been awesome.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.